Hi, everybody. Can I just introduce the two of us to kick off this panel, which I think is titled Current International Challenges. I see in the day's program that it is a large pink box with nothing in it, so I hope you're expecting that we will provide some content for it. This is Dr. Manoush Shafiq, Perm-Sec of DFID. I'm Peter Ricketts, the Perm-Sec of the Foreign Office, and we are two of three departments that are now working extremely closely together in the international area. The third colleague not present but here in spirit is Bill Jeffrey, the MOD Perm-Sec. We have worked very, very closely over the last couple of years. We've traveled together to Iraq and Afghanistan. Manoush and I have traveled together to Sudan to show that the two departments at all levels really are cooperating extremely closely. What we were going to do, I think, is for Manoush to kick off with some thoughts on the international arena and the main challenges there. I'll then follow up with a few thoughts on top of that, but we are mostly interested to have a discussion and debate, and therefore please save up your most difficult questions for Manoush when we both finished. So maybe I can immediately ask Manoush to get us started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Peter. Peter's being typically modest because he's just gotten off a plane from Zimbabwe. So it's fantastic that he's standing up at the moment, much less giving you an overview of world politics, which I'm sure he'll do incredibly well in a moment. But I'm the warm-up act. So let me start by first actually harking a little bit back before I look forward. And hark a little bit back to the millennium, when we were at a time of enormous prosperity and optimism about the world. And at the time of the millennium, the world made all sorts of commitments that reflected that period of prosperity and optimism, including a set of commitments at the UN Millennium Summit that launched the Millennial Development Goals and committed to halving world poverty by 2015. Since that optimistic, hopeful global moment, there have been many challenges. First came 9/11, which some would argue was the first kind of stress test of globalization. The dot-com bubble burst. We've had two wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've had a food crisis and a commodity boom, all of which had profound impacts for poor people across the planet. The food crisis got about another 200 million into poverty. The oil price increase cost another 20-odd million into poverty. And of course that had huge consequences in countries around the world. But then came the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. And things have never been the same. The World Bank expects that output growth for developing countries will fall sharply this year, and in sub-Saharan Africa, for the first time in a long time, after many years of very good growth performance, we will see falling per capita income levels. And we think the consequence of that will be an additional 90 million people in poverty. This economic crisis has caused a huge amount of activity by Western governments to try and respond. I remember when drafts of the G20 communique were circulating, they kept looking in the thesaurus for alternatives to the word unprecedented, because it kept appearing so frequently. These are unprecedented times, these are unprecedented policy actions. But they truly are. The number I always cite to kind of make people sit up and listen and realize how extraordinary a time we're in globally is to think about the cost of the first U.S. bank bailout, which was $4.6 trillion. That's the first one, not the last one approved by the Obama administration. The cost of that bailout alone cost more than the combined costs of the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe, the total cost of going to the moon, the savings and loan crisis, the Korean War, the New Deal, the Iraq War, the Vietnam War. And we haven't even begun to be finished yet. So the scale of the resources that have been mobilized to deal with this economic crisis really, truly, and not using the word casually, are unprecedented. And we're also trying things that we've never tried before. Words like quantitative easing have become part of our vocabulary, even though we've never used this as a policy before to deal with an economic crisis. And countries like the UK and the US are running budget deficits on the order of 12%, which, as one commentator said, is getting into Banana Republic territory. This effort, probably, well, let me stop for a minute. I think what this crisis has brought home most to me is how truly interdependent we are. Some people would say this economic crisis was the second stress test of globalization, and we failed. But it has brought home how incredibly interconnected all of our lives have become. The fact that quite a large number of people in the Sun Belt of the United States have defaulted on their subprime mortgages have brought our banks down. And the choices that China will make about whether it builds another coal-fired power plant every day, which is what it's doing today, has huge consequences for our own climate. And just as an example, the flooding that occurred in the UK in 2007, which cost £3 billion to fix. And similarly, some very disgruntled people on the borders of Afghanistan and Pakistan can end up inspiring bombs on buses in London not so many years ago. That interdependence and the consequences thereof is the central theme of a white paper that DFID launched this week called Eliminating World Poverty, Building Our Common Future. And what that white paper argues is that because this crisis has shown us how interdependent we are, we need to think of solving global problems and many of our own local problems through global means. And in this economic crisis, we need to think not just of bailing out the banks, but also of bailing out the poor and mitigating the negative impacts and the long-term consequences. If you think about a child in a poor, well, let me just give an example of what the consequences are. In this country, when an economic crisis hits, we do have a safety net. People get unemployment benefits. There is a welfare state. In a poor country, when a crisis hits, families have to turn to desperate measures, fewer meals, pulling their kids out of school because they can't afford the fees anymore or can't afford to have them not be working. Children who are malnourished in early childhood suffer permanent cognitive brain damage. These are consequences which are multi-generational and have huge impact. When you look at what happened to, say, in Indonesia when the East Asian crisis occurred, we can attribute half the poverty in Indonesia today to the consequences of that crisis many, many years ago. And so a global crisis requires a global coherent response. And the UK lead at the G20 summit was an extraordinary example of the world coming together to solve that problem. We're quite proud of the fact that the G20 summit here in London was probably one of the first in which the needs of low-income countries and poor people was at the top of the agenda. And the outcome was quite extraordinary. Low-income countries benefited with a total package of about $50 billion of financing from the IMF from that summit. And that hasn't been, I can reassuringly tell you, just a promise that was signed by a bunch of world leaders and then nothing happened. If you travel around Africa today and you talk to African finance ministers, they will tell you that they are actually getting additional financing and resources that are enabling them to continue to fund health, education, and social programs in their countries during this crisis as a result of those decisions made at the G20 summit. And the UK is continuing to push to make sure that those promises are delivered. Let me also say something else about the agenda going forward and what the future international challenges are. Everyone I know these days is quoting that Rahm Emanuel quote about, Obama's chief of staff who says, never let a good crisis go to waste. These kinds of moments do create opportunities for reform. And there are many things that we could do in the current context that we might not have imagined before. A good example is the change in the legitimacy, the change in global governance. We've all seen the rise of China, India, Brazil, Russia, countries that didn't have a seat at the global table in the past, who are now an incredibly important part of solving problems like climate change. And issues like climate change will have to be solved collectively in a way that other global problems were not solved in the past. We also need to make sure going forward that we avoid protectionism. And while there have been some protectionist measures put into place, it's actually, when you look at the content of those measures, there actually hasn't been the rapid sort of run to protectionism that we saw in the 1930s, and that's been a key part of the recovery, not being as slow as it might have been. And the other big theme going forward is conflict. We know that we'll increasingly have to deal in conflict countries, and for DFID that will also mean that we'll have to increasingly put more of our money into countries that are at risk of conflict. In that context, I wanted to take this opportunity to mention the launch of a recruitment campaign for something called the Civil Service Stabilization Cadre. Because as we realize that more and more of the work that will have to be done in conflict zones will have to be done by civilians, the Prime Minister announced last year that he would like to put together a cadre of civilians who will work and be deployable in conflict countries to bring the benefits of peace, stability, and growth to those countries. What we're aiming for is to have 200 civil servants across government who are willing and able to work in fragile states around the world. This will be led by the Joint Stabilization Unit, which is a unit that's jointly managed by DFID, the Foreign Office, and the MOD. And we're looking for a wide variety of skills and experience. You don't have to be a conflict resolution expert to have a post in a fragile country. And this is an opportunity that will allow people to bring a lot of core civil service skills into a new context to try and deal with global issues. This will include roles in management, leadership, admin support, providing policy advice in areas like public finance, health, and strategic communications. So if you're interested and this session whets your appetite for playing a more global role, please do go see the stand which has been set up about the Civil Service Stabilization Cadre. There'll be many people there who've actually served in conflict countries and in fragile states, and they can give you a feel for what it's like. Let me conclude by saying this crisis has hit the poorest of the world incredibly hard, and it's vital that we do everything we can to mitigate that impact. But this crisis has also opened up new opportunities and possibilities which we can seize to create more credible international institutions, to tackle global issues like climate change, poverty, and conflict. Like never before, it's shown us that we're definitely in this together, and that expression, "no man is an island," could not be truer. But in order to respond to that interconnectedness, and the realization that our future is very common, we need to look at working together much better, both across government departments, as we've been forging between the FCO, DFID, and the MOD, but also globally with other countries and other partners. And there is a real opportunity for all civil servants to do that, reaching out to partners in other countries and in other departments to try and make interconnectedness a positive force for the future rather than a risk. With that, I'll turn to Peter.
Thank you very much indeed, Manoush. Just for visual variety, I think I'll just stay sitting down. And maybe I can summarize your economic analysis with my President Yeltsin story, which is when Yeltsin was president, he was visiting the US, and one day he had a press conference with the US press corps, and he emerged into the daylight, blinking a bit, and somebody said, "Mr. President, if you had one word, how would you describe the situation in Russia?" And he said, "Good." Silence. So another journalist said, "Just to draw you out, Mr. President, if you had two words, how would you describe the situation in Russia?" And he said, "Not good." And sometimes the global economy feels a little bit like that to me. Minouche set out very well some of the dimensions of this economic crisis. Let me just embroider around that with some thoughts that we've had on the foreign policy implications of the crisis and what they mean for us. First of all, it's not all bad news. I mean, if you think back this year, we have had a pretty remarkable series of elections, actually. We've had the election of President Obama, which was, I think, a transformational event in international affairs. We had a tremendous election in India, the world's biggest democracy. We had an election in Lebanon, which showed people turning against Hezbollah and the extremists and in favor of the moderates. And we are just in the middle of an election in Indonesia, another huge democracy, which looks like it's returning a candidate at the first round. We had the elections in Iran, which, after a lot of brave demonstration by the people of Iran, seem to be being crushed. And therefore, as always, the picture is very mixed. Some of the issues that we're dealing with are barely affected by the economic crisis. It perhaps makes things even more difficult for a country like Sudan and coping in Darfur. It doesn't seem to make any measurable difference to the Burmese at all. Somalia continues to sink in chaos and crisis. Zimbabwe, I'm just back from, at least they've stopped hyperinflation. One of my staff there gave me a $100 trillion note, which I have in my briefcase, which is the largest note ever printed, I think. Now completely worthless, of course, because they moved to the dollar. But basically, Zimbabwe is bumping along, and the economic crisis doesn't affect them very much. Foreign ministries and development ministries find that they are dealing with a legacy of a whole series of international problems and issues, and in addition, having to cope with the effects of the economic recession. And I think that you can pick out a number of the implications of that, rather as Minouche has done. One is interdependence works on the downside as well as the upside. The subprime crisis in America led to governments falling in Iceland, Latvia, Hungary, at least, probably others. Where an economy was already weak, it made it worse. Pakistan, for example, and their economic crisis reads through directly into national security problems for the UK, given the threat from terrorism towards the UK. Those countries, very dependent on commodity prices, have really been through a roller coaster. And I think you can pretty much correlate Russian intransigence and truculence against the oil price. When the oil price is $140, the Russians are impossible. When the oil price is at $40, they become a bit more amenable to reason. Iran, perhaps something of the same, actually. Of course, countries that are very exposed to world trade suffer a lot. UK has had a big hit, but Singapore, their GDP is down 12%, I think, because they are very open to world trade, and they've suffered particularly hard. And it's had a differential effect. Those countries who'd been through the stress test of the banking crisis in Asia 10 years ago, their banks were fine this time because they had been more prudent over the last decade. Some general sort of geopolitical effects. I think the crisis is speeding up the shift of economic power and centre of gravity towards Asia. If the Chinese recover and are growing again at 8-9% after a year or so, and the Western world is stuck around zero, the transfer of economic power eastwards is going to continue. The crisis has also sucked out a lot of the oxygen from the important but longer run issues. I'm thinking particularly of climate change, where if we hadn't had the crisis, perhaps the world would have been more prepared than it is now for Copenhagen in November. As it is, it's going to be a real sprint to get any useful results from Copenhagen, because top leaders have been focused on the recession and reducing job losses at home rather than the long-run important issues like climate or like the Doha round, which has not really picked up speed again since the arrival of President Obama. Again, the picture is always mixed. It's not all doom and gloom on the longer-run implications for policy of the crisis. In an area like energy security, the fact that we've had this great volatility in prices, I think, has concentrated minds on more resilience in the European energy market, for example, and the fact that a lot of our countries are making a major fiscal stimulus has opened up the opportunity for green investment, that the recovery will be greener as a result of the fact that government is making a lot of public investment in the coming years. Just thinking about the implications for us as civil servants. We've spent a lot of time around the Permanent Secretary table with Gus O'Donnell looking at how we should keep our focus on the longer term as well as the short term. Inevitably, in an economic crisis and in our electoral cycle, ministers' minds are going to be concentrated on the short term. But we must have a responsibility for looking at the longer term trends, trying to keep the focus on issues like climate, like energy, like trade policy, which need to be got right on a 5-year horizon. We also need to be looking at the implications for global governance. Minouche mentioned this, of the sort of shifts that we've been talking about. Is the G8 still the right vehicle to handle these sorts of international, economic and political issues? It's meeting at the moment in Italy, but I suspect most people are feeling this is a slightly weird setup now. We've had 2 meetings of the G20 format. Now we've got another G8 with the 5 other countries coming for a cup of coffee on the second day. It doesn't feel quite right. It may be that we're seeing the emergence of a larger grouping around G20 or something like that as the forum for handling these big global issues. It also puts higher up the agenda the very, very difficult issue of Security Council reform, which we are going to have to find a solution to one of these days. And actually the UK has got quite a forward position on that, but some other permanent members are much less willing to see their precious status on the Security Council weakened. So a lot of longer run issues which we need to be thinking about, even if the immediate crisis agenda is rather different. I think the other lesson it's taught us as civil servants is that working across departmental boundaries is more important than ever. I mean, this crisis has showed us, if anything ever needed to, that there's no real difference between foreign policy and domestic policy. And as the DFID White Paper sets out, the spectrum between development and security is a very tight, intense network. We've got to be more effective at working between departments. We've mentioned the joint working between DFID, MOD and FCO. It also often involves many other departments as well, probably a number of you in this room. And working internationally is a really good opportunity. As Minouche was saying, either in the conflict zones, through the new cadre that we're setting up, or indeed in other areas, going off as a specialist to one of the embassies or a DFID office internationally working on climate or migration policy or counter-terrorism, or one of the many disciplines that take civil servants internationally now. It really does tick all the PSG boxes, and it's a developmental experience which I think most people appreciate when they do it. So a plug for thinking about some time in an international job during your career, and I guess now Minouche and I are very willing to open up ourselves to any thoughts, questions, comments that you have. Can't see where.
Hi.
Right. You're there. Okay, brilliant.
If I could just go back to the thing you mentioned about the UN Security Council.
Yeah.
And perhaps ask you what you think, if you're able to say the table might look like in, say, 10 years' time with new members, some members coming out, European Union seat potentially. Are you able to give any thoughts on that, possibly?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can say pretty clearly the sort of shape of the table that we would like to see if we had our way, which is that we would like to see, I shall miss one out whenever I list these, Germany, Brazil, South Africa, Japan come on as permanent members given their economic weight, and then perhaps rather larger number of non-permanent members who circulate and do 2 years on and then leave. I'm not confident we're going to get consensus from all the members of the Security Council on that, even on a 10-year time horizon. And so there are ideas around for an interim solution which would put those countries and some others on for longer periods as sort of temporary members rather than fully graduating to permanent member status. So you might have a council that's now 15, perhaps of 24 or something like that, and the additional people would be on for a longer period, like 6 years or 9 years. And then at the end of that, you could see whether we were yet in a place to confirm them as permanent members. I suspect we'll have to go to it in 2 steps. Do you want to pass the mic along to the gentleman there?
Hi. Just a couple of questions for Minusha, actually. What do you think? Do you think DFID's engagement policy with countries such as, for example, Nigeria, is really effective in view of the fact that we have a crisis in the Niger Delta and so on, and Nigeria has got a reputation of having squandered its oil resources for the last pre-Abacha days, in fact. And do you think perhaps DFID engagement should be more along thematic lines, like governance across the board, rather than bits and pieces around the globe?
Okay, on Nigeria, I mean, the truth is we just can't ignore Nigeria. 1 in 4 Africans is a Nigerian. There is no way that we will achieve the Millennial Development Goals if we don't tackle Nigeria. And although one has the illusion that Nigeria, someone once said to me, Nigeria is a very rich country with lots of poor people in it. And in the north, the northern Nigeria has some of the worst social indicators in the world. The number of women, girls out of school, the number of women who die in childbirth, it is truly, truly staggering. But you rightly note that the Niger Delta is a mess. We don't have programs in the Niger Delta, thankfully. And there are really serious issues about corruption and governance. But for us, I think our strategy in Nigeria is to help them manage their own resources better, because of course Nigeria is a rich country, but the way that the government manages its own resources is often not very effective. And so we've been working quite a lot on that, as well as funding core programs in the poorest parts of Nigeria, like a massive program to get girls into school in the north. We're also being quite tough on the corruption issues. So DFID funds a unit in the Met Police in the city, who cracks down on corruption issues. And if any money coming from Nigeria illegally ends up in a UK bank, we have had very specific prosecutions against those people and have actually been able to repatriate money back to Nigeria as a result of that. So we work on both ends of the issue, recognizing how complicated it is, and at the same time keeping the longer term in view, which is ultimately Africa won't develop unless Nigeria does, and there are huge development challenges there that we can't ignore. In terms of your second question, I presume that's not a Nigeria-specific question in terms of focusing on governance rather than specific countries. I think in terms of how we allocate our aid, we actually use evidence on what do we know. All the best research that's been done on how aid can be used effectively shows that aid can be used effectively based on 2 criteria: how many poor people there are in the country and how good its policies are. So aid is used well when there's lots of poor people and lots of poverty and the government has pretty decent policies. So we use those 2 criteria to then look at all the countries in the world and figure out where we should be putting our money. And we tend to put more money into countries that have better policies and lots of poor people. So Ethiopia is a good example. Many issues in Ethiopia, but actually the government has been incredibly effective at getting people out of poverty, getting kids into school, creating jobs. Should we a thematic focus like governance? I think I have to say governance features in every single program that we do. But it doesn't necessarily determine which countries we're in. We look at where the aid is going to be more effective to choose the country, and then within that country, pick the governance issues that are the most important for promoting development in that country. So governance features, but not as the criteria for aid allocation, would be my answer.
Right. Lady over here.
Hello, I'm Jill Rutter from DEFRA. I'm Director of Sustainable Development, so you probably won't be totally surprised by my question. I always thought it was Hillary Clinton who made the comment about crisis, so I'm very pleased to know that it's Rahm Emanuel instead. But I think you will waste a good crisis if you wrongly analyse the causes of that crisis. And I think it's very interesting how the narrative on the crisis changed one weekend in September. It basically changed when Lehman's collapsed, and we rapidly went into a crisis all about the Western banking system, risks of systemic collapse, etc. From the narrative actually that we were developing quite successfully in the summer, that this was actually a multi-pronged crisis, And that was when we were looking with a lot of concern, I'm sure DFID very concerned about the rise of spikes in food prices, both with domestic implications and with much, much, much more serious implications for poor countries, the rise in commodity prices. I was very struck by Peter's comment that the rise in commodity prices had basically put climate change off the agenda, but put energy security on the agenda, which I think if you analyse is a very strange statement, because I think it does that if you see the crisis in one sense. If you basically say that we're going to be looking forward to living in a world which has increasingly restrained and resource pressures, we actually ought to have seen, and were I think last summer, till we were overtaken by the banking collapse, seeing this as actually what our Secretary of State has called a crisis of sustainability. Bob Watson, our Chief Scientist, gave a session this morning called the crisis of sustainability, basically a trailer for a whole bunch of problems to come as an increasing world population puts pressure on natural resources across the globe. We see the impacts of rising demand from China and India kicking in well before the IEA and other people saw them having real effects on world commodity prices, topped off with a bit of speculation. I know there's some bubbling around there, and a crisis that is yet to come. So it's, in a sense, I think it's a sort of quite a critique of the West that we got so overwhelmed by our own, I don't want to trivialise, but sort of local difficulty that we forgot about those big underlying drivers when we were coming to solutions, now having to sort of backtrack and get that back again. And also, I think, as it goes to coherence, some of the things that are problematic about the British government's response, and we in DEFRA were particularly concerned that one of the immediate responses, which goes against a lot about energy security, must go against a lot of diplomatic efforts, was to go and ask the oil producers to produce more, which is giving some rather odd and conflicting signals, rather than say, actually, this shows we need to accelerate our transition to a lower carbon economy, get off fossil fuel dependence across the West, etc., and this has given us a real wake-up call. So I just think that we need, and I think the DFID White Paper now has done quite a good job of that, actually recognise that there were multiple crises last year, and some of those were just trailers of the really big crises to come. And once we have restored the health of the banking system, etc., a lot of those underlying factors will be with us for a long time to come.
Yeah, just 3 quick points. I mean, first, I think that you're right that the financial crisis overwhelmed the food and fuel crises which had occurred previously. And I think it overwhelmed it because just there were so many more knots behind the numbers. And it was just an issue of scale. And clearly, you know, the climate, my second point would be what Nick Stern always says, which is he says, you know, this financial crisis is very serious. And climate change is even more serious. But of course, it was a classic case of, you know, the immediate and the urgent overtaking the longer term. I think over the past few months, we've made quite an effort to try and rebalance that debate. And I think the announcement that the Prime Minister made about 10 days ago on climate finance in the run-up to Copenhagen was fantastically important, where for the first time the UK was the first country to lay out its position on climate finance, of how we would finance a climate deal if we could get one. Because of course, as everyone knows, that is one of the main obstacles to a deal in Copenhagen. And the UK said quite clearly that we'd be committed to financing a climate deal, that $100 billion would be made available by 2020 to help poor countries cope with the costs of mitigation and adaptation, and took a very forward position. So I think we are beginning to see the longer-term challenges re-emerge. And of course, the G8, while it may not deliver a lot, may actually deliver a US clarity and position on climate change, which will also be very, very important. So I hope the pendulum is swinging back a bit to address the longer-term issues.
Maybe the gentleman at the back.
Hi, yes, good afternoon. Sami Jagedi from the Home Office. I came in a bit late to this, but I think I got the gist of what it's about. International challenges for the UK. Now, from what I can tell, we're sort of more focused on globalization. And it appears that in the West today, we are focused on surrendering our, shall I say, security to China and India and other countries. But I'm trying to wonder whether we know the implications of shifting the balance of power to the East. You know, are we really ready for the implications of that, security-wise? Because the West has survived for so long because of its trade and industry. We've offloaded our trade and industry to the East. And I think we've got a very major unemployment crisis coming in Europe because of that. That's to come. But are we ready? Do we have contingency plans for, let's just say this all breaks down. We don't know the way Europe is going to go. I mean, they're all waiting on the Irish vote in autumn. That's one thing. What if we get certain dictators in China who say, look, we're not having any more of this globalization thing, when they go back strict communism? Do we have contingency plans for that? Not just for things on the world basis, but our own country. Because if unemployment, I mean, we don't know where these jobs are going to be replaced. They've all been taken east. So what are we going to do here? What are we getting from our international partners that balances the scale of what we've exported?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I don't really agree with you that we are surrendering our security to China and India. I don't think we're doing that at all. What we were talking about, I think, is an objective judgment that if you look at economic growth over the next 10 or 20 years, you can see that China and India are growing faster than Europe and America. And that is going to mean that they have a greater share of growth and a greater share of world trade. And that's not anything that the government wants or plans for. It's happening out there, and the government has very little control over it. You ask if we got any contingency plans. I think our biggest contingency plan is to be tying China and India and other fast-growing economies into the multilateral system, into the WTO, into the World Bank and the IMF, into groups like a G20, so that their economic weight is reflected in political representation as well. They're there at the top table. They're able to influence the way we make policy on these global issues. That's, I think, that's the contingency plan. I don't think China is going to slide back into communist dictatorship. I think all the drivers in China are towards opening up, actually, and engaging in the world. I think that's in our interest. And a multilateral system that gives full weight to these countries as they grow economically is our best insurance, I think, to keep the world the way we need it to be, which is open, trading, with as few restrictions as possible. So, I mean, there are risks, of course, but I think that's what we're doing to try to mitigate. Lady in the front here, please.
My name's Deirdre Watson, and I'm from DFID, so I'll put my question to Peter, but it could be either of you.
Fair enough.
In the civil service paper here, Douglas Hurd has an article in which he criticises too much restructuring of departments, but at the same time makes a recommendation that DFID moves into FCO. You and Manoush have talked about how much work you have done together with Bill Jeffries on international policy and also on organisational efficiencies. Do you think that we are doing enough international work jointly, or do you think we need to do more? Or is it a question that what we're doing, we have to communicate more effectively within the political and public debate?
Okay, let me start on that. First of all, it's in the end a decision for the Prime Minister and Ministers with creating and merging and splitting departments. If you want my personal view, I think it is often a tremendous waste of effort and resources to do that. And the second thing I'd say is that sitting from the Foreign Office, one of the most successful departmental creations of the last 12 years has been DFID, actually. I know there's an old sort of urban myth that the FCO somehow resents DFID and wishes DFID was back with the FCO. I don't think that's true at all. I think DFID has proved to be a really successful and effective department, and I don't just say that because you're both looking at me. I think it's true. And so I would not go back on that. I would not remerge. I would keep DFID doing what DFID does best, but I would make sure that what is already happening, that DFID and the FCO and the MOD and other parts of government are working really closely together. And the DFID white paper, I think, reflects that very close consultation. So that's been a successful machinery of government change. I don't say that they've all been as successful as that. We've got a couple in the front here, and then, okay, this gentleman here first, and then two here.
Thanks. Alan Webster from the Home Office. It's a question from Manoush around public attitudes to aid. And we've seen recently the government made no claims that aid will have a significant cut, and under the Conservative government, it'll be one of two departments which will be protected from any cuts, which firstly probably makes most of us in this room very envious. And secondly, there may be public attitude changes there. And we've seen a recent poll which said that it was the area most people would like to see significant cuts made. And I was wondering how the department and how government can make the case for aid in a decade of likely tight financial constraints.
Well, in many ways, that was the exact objective of this white paper, which was to demonstrate that actually in tough times, in tough economic times, you need more aid, not less, because our well-being is intimately connected with the well-being of others. And I think we would argue that the investment that we make in development is actually it was one of the highest return investments that we can make. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of that. If you look at the climate change example, the floods in the UK in 2007 cost £3 billion in terms of damage to property and flood barriers that had to be repaired. If we can influence China's energy choices, like we're trying to do with the Environment Transformation Fund, which DFID helped set up with the World Bank to try and change China's energy choices, that's billions of pounds of savings for the UK. If you look at the Home Office issue, the top 10 countries of asylum seekers in the UK, 8 of them are countries that are in conflict or immediately post-conflict, topped by countries like Afghanistan and Pakistan, where if through our development efforts we can create jobs and prosperity in those countries, there will be far fewer pressures on asylum for the UK. So I can rattle off lots more examples like this, but we are in a world in which, I think, as Peter said, the issues between domestic and foreign are increasingly blurred, especially for a small open economy like the UK, which has got open borders and open trading links to the rest of the world. Now, I don't want to make it sound like the UK's development programme is about the UK's national self-interest, because it's not. It's also a moral cause, and a cause in which we think we're quite proud of the fact that on the international stage, this is a huge priority for us, and it is part of our being responsible global citizens and doing our fair share to help the poorest. And in our polling of UK citizens, we find that actually 3/4 of the population broadly support international development. The issue they have is they don't often know how it's being spent, and everyone worries about corruption and misuse of money, which is why we're so adamant in the white paper to demonstrate that we can show real results, but we're also going to be quite tough on issues of corruption and effectiveness of the funds, so that we make sure that we're getting value for money for this very big and important investment.
I promise two, one behind the other.
Good afternoon, Sir Peter and Minouche. If I may, perhaps I've got 2 short questions, and perhaps if I could ask one of you to answer one of each. So the first is, I was reading recently about a line of thought that there are certain groups in China who view certain international organisations, such as the WTO, as very much having been created and moulded in a Western fashion, and therefore that the Americans and the British and others are very keen to get China's involvement in such organisations, precisely because we were the ones that sat down and drew up the blueprints, as it were. Therefore, in your view, are we going to be faced with a challenge, an international challenge, in convincing particularly China, but perhaps arguably India and the BRIC nations that it's worth their while signing on to these organisations, rather than going it alone and setting up bilateral and pan-Asian organisations of their own? The second question, which is perhaps more down the development line, is one of the things I consistently struggle to get my head around, sorry, I'm at the Ministry of Defence, by the way, is the challenges we face in terms of aiding other countries with development. I think that a lot of developing countries will probably look at previous successes of countries like Britain and our wealth and our prosperity, and they will think to themselves that we got to that point by, through techniques like industrialization and, consumption on a massive personal scale. And I think we face a genuine challenge in terms of reconciling that with sustainable growth and adopting practices which aren't going to be so damaging to our environment. So how can we avoid, my second question I suppose is, how can we avoid the charge from developing countries that we're hypocritical because we all drive our own cars, we all enjoy flying. You know, we want them to listen to us and we want them to believe that we're committed to this, but how do we avoid that charge of hypocrisy? So, sorry, 2 questions.
All right. And we'll try and be brief so we've got plenty of time to bring in others. Shall I do the first one?
Yeah, you do first.
I'll do the easy one, you do the hard one.
Thank you.
Thank you. No, 2 very good questions. Well, I think in the international institutions, the short answer is no, they won't be the same as China and India and other emerging economies join and take part. We've got to be prepared to reform and change the international organizations to reflect the agendas and the priorities of these countries as well. We can't just expect them to join Western clubs. You're absolutely right. Actually, they've already, they've been participating in the IMF and the World Bank for some time. They're familiar with that. The sort of trade and the climate and other organizations that we're going to need over the next decade or 2 are going to have to reflect their agenda as well. And that's not going to be easy for us. We're going to have to let go a bit of our influence internationally, globally, in order to make space in the top table for these people. But if we don't do that, then, as you say, they will go their own way and we will get splits and blocks redeveloping, which is absolutely not in our interest. So that's going to take a certain amount of sort of far-sightedness, I think, on the part of Western countries, but we've got to do it.
Absolutely. And just on the accusations of hypocrisy, quite right. I mean, I think there's 2 ways that we can show that we're not hypocrites. One is by adjusting our own behavior, so being serious about meeting our own targets for reducing carbon emissions. And 2, we can compensate them for the cost to them of mitigating their own carbon emissions and having to adapt to the climate change that we have caused. And I think unless we do those 2 things, change our own behavior, but also help compensate them for helping us to clean up the mess we made, we won't be seen as credible. And frankly, those are the key elements of a deal at Copenhagen.
Please.
Thank you. My name's Andrea Ledward from CLG. I just wanted to build on the previous question about levels of aid. And obviously there are going to be cuts across all the public services, and I'm sure at the same time DIF is trying to keep the increased commitment to increase the percentage of GDP going into aid. But I just wonder if you could kind of look ahead and think about what do you think it's really going to look like in, say, 5 or 10 years' time about how we do our aid programs and how we deliver aid? Because presumably there are going to have to be significant changes. I was thinking about what you said about the kind of shift in the balance of power to India and China, and whether we're going to be doing more kind of lobbying them to increase their aid budgets. And where do you really see the big significant changes coming in terms of the way that we do it?
Okay. And I think just a very brief answer to that. I think looking at 5 or 10 years, if we are successful at creating an international system that can cope with this kind of interdependence in dealing with global problems, I would imagine that more of our aid would be channeled through more effective multilateral institutions and for dealing with issues like climate change. And, if we can get a UN system which is better at managing conflict and post-conflict situation, again, more through those kinds of channels, which will hopefully become both more legitimate because they'll have accommodated the new powers, but also more effective. I think the second thing is that our bilateral program, I mean, we're constantly asking ourselves, are we really needed there? So, in DFID we've closed 12 country offices in the last couple of years because we felt that the countries had grown and developed and they didn't need us anymore and they don't need aid anymore. And so we move on and go to the next frontier and go to more and more difficult and poorer countries. And so that process of moving toward the frontier, I think, will also continue in the next 5 or 10 years as we move out of countries that are able to stand on their own 2 feet, but increasingly takes us into much tougher and more intractable poverty problems.
Just an example of the way the world is changing. I was in South Africa yesterday, and I gather that the South Africans are now going to become aid donors, and they are talking to DFID about how to set up a development ministry and how to do it. I mean, they'll do it with their own way, no doubt, but the South Africas and the Indias over time will become significant donors, I think. So, the world does shift. Now then, let's have somebody from over here.
Thomas from DFID. I was in a session just before lunch on the capability reviews, and we were talking about working with across Whitehall and with other delivery partners. And there were quite a few themes in our discussion that you picked up earlier about recognising the longer-term challenges and thinking about domestic and international linked together, as well as more practical things like joint units different staff working in joint teams. There was one area of our discussion that you didn't really investigate earlier, which I'd be interested to hear your thoughts, which was about how do conflicting priorities between partners get resolved. And there was a feeling in our group earlier that often those priorities really get raised to a very high level for resolution. And I was just wondering if you, from your experiences, where you've seen those conflicting priorities being dealt with effectively. Thanks.
Well, can I perhaps start, and it's the obvious one for Manoush and me to talk about, which is conflicting priorities on conflict.
Yes, I was thinking of that too. That's right.
We have faced a real budget squeeze on the money available in Whitehall for doing conflict prevention work, and indeed conflict mitigating work, mainly because the cost of UN peacekeeping is spiralling, sterling is falling, and the Treasury aren't giving us any more money. And so we've got into a real crunch this year where we have had to do some pretty drastic prioritising, i.e. stopping doing things. And that has required the three departments to sit round and have some very difficult discussions, because I think each department tended to have some sort of areas that they wanted to prioritise. We had to put those together, eventually come out with a compromise, which then had to go to ministers, because yes, and these things are political, and choices about where you spend public money are usually political in the end, and get ministers to agree and make a statement in Parliament about it. But it was a genuine prioritising exercise in which we all lost things that were dear to us and which we wanted to preserve because there simply wasn't the money. But the main thing is we did it trilaterally, and all three Secretaries of State signed off on it. So I think that's the way you have to do it. I mean, you have to, in the end, sit down and work out between you which are genuinely the lowest priorities, and they get dropped. And it's often very difficult.
The only thing I would add is that we do have, I think we've had a lot more success when we have delegated decision-making to the field. And so I think increasingly we have lots of good examples of embassies overseas, DFID offices, presence from other government departments, resolving issues in country and never having to come back to London. And the more we've done that, the more, I think, success we've had at getting things resolved much closer to the coalface, where you usually end up with the right answer, and probably a bit less territoriality, because you're all in it together there.
Yeah. For example, all the Afghanistan program money is now managed by Kabul, by the interdepartmental team in Kabul. And it's a lot of money. It's tens of millions of pounds, and that is managed and project managed in Kabul. And as you say, I think it is easier sometimes. Right, we've still got about 15, 20 minutes if people have got the patience for us.
10 minutes.
10 minutes, somebody told. 10 minutes, okay. There was a question here, somebody was keen to ask.
One over there.
The gentleman here. We're going to 2:15.
Can I go first?
Yes. Where's the voice coming from?
Me.
Yeah, you go.
Hi, I'm Rishi Raithatha from the NAO. You mentioned Ethiopia, which was quite interesting. I actually visited Ethiopia last year, and I would, from my personal viewpoint, I'd say Meles Zenawi is not too far off, falling into the category of a big man. The people I spoke to there's certain freedoms that are still banned, and I found that websites such as blogspot.com were banned. You wouldn't think it's a big deal, but one thing I did notice was that there was a huge presence of Chinese in Ethiopia. And from my academic studies, I've learned that the Chinese have a huge presence in Africa, where they're potentially usurping the EU, the UK, the US, and other Western countries in aid involvement. So I wanted to ask what implications there were for the UK with this Chinese involvement, and what the UK was doing about it.
Well, China has become a huge player in Africa. Chinese investment in Africa now exceeds all official development assistance to Africa. It's a very striking number. We have mixed views on this. I think on net, we think it's a good thing because China brings investment, it brings skills, it brings export markets to Africa, which are ultimately going to be good for Africa's prosperity. Many African leaders are attracted to Chinese assistance because it doesn't come with as many political strings around governance and democratization and all that stuff as some Western aid. Having said that, I think China is also very aware of the risks to its own investments in very autocratic places. So, for example, they're very present in Zimbabwe. And they were increasingly nervous about Mugabe's behavior because their own investments are in jeopardy in unstable regimes. Similarly, in Zambia, heavily invested in the copper mines. When the Chinese presence in Zambia became a political issue in the last Zambian elections, and where people were in the streets saying, we don't want Chinese imperialism and Chinese workers running our copper mines, the Chinese were shocked because suddenly they were being seen as imperialists, which is not a role that they had ever seen themselves as. And so they've now also become much more sensitive about not sending so many Chinese workers in the investments that they've made in the minerals sectors and having many more local workers and local managers. So I think the logic of their engagement in Africa will take them to a place where they will care a lot more about governance over time, and they will care a lot about stability over time. What are we doing about it? We're actually doing quite a lot. We've got quite an active set of discussions with China about its role in Africa, and we are working with them in many countries. So just as an example, they're making huge investments in DRC and roads, and we in DFID are working with them, and we said to them, look, you're putting these roads in. We know from what happened in the Amazon that when you built roads in the Amazon, suddenly huge deforestation, huge loss to the world. When you build these roads, why don't we work alongside you and work on the environmental and social consequences of this road construction for indigenous people and for the climate? And the Chinese, who were very smart, very sophisticated, they knew there was a risk to them, and they would be, global condemnation if there was a suddenly massive destruction of the second largest rainforest in the world. And so we are working alongside them where we can in many countries to try and kind of bring them along, learn from them, but also have them benefit from our own experience of working in Africa.
Who else has got a question? Let's just take a census and see if we can deal with 2 or 3 fairly quickly.
There's one over there who's been
okay.
For a long time.
Lady here, gentleman at the back, and the gentleman on the far left as we look at it. Maybe we could have all the 3 questions together and then we'll just answer them collectively so that we get everybody in. Please.
Hi. You mentioned the Iranian elections, and because of the history of the relationship between the 2 countries, there is a tendency for hardliners in that country to blame Britain for quite a lot of things. I was just interested in your views of how we can deal with that and have a situation where they don't keep sort of crushing the opposition by using Britain as an excuse.
Really difficult question. Please.
I think a question for Peter Ricketts. You made some remarks about possible adjustments to the G8 and G20 governance in due course. And I've got a similar sort of question about the European Union. I wonder what your views are on the medium-term prospects for enlargement, possible adjustments to the governance as a result of that, and where you see the UK's interests lying in that.
Okay, I'll do that one. Can we have this gentleman who's been waiting very patiently on the left wing here?
Returning to some of the points already made about interdepartmental cooperation, I wondered if I'd ask you both, and acknowledging that Sir Bill Jeffrey is not here to speak his piece, if you like, what parts your respective departments will be playing in the forthcoming defence review, and perhaps more importantly, what you might regard as good outcomes from it.
Okay. I'll start with the first 2 and then ask Minouche to do the last one. The Iranian elections, we find it intensely frustrating that we have been trying to build a relationship with Iran, recognizing, yes, there's been difficult history, and in the past Britain has interfered in Iran, if you go back to 1959, but we're not doing it now. We are trying to get a dialogue going. Of course we want to see a free and fair election. We did nothing, none of our staff did anything beyond what every embassy does to go and observe election rallies and so on. And yet we get blamed as if somehow Britain has manipulated the whole thing, got 1 million people on the streets of Tehran, and it's all our fault. Sometimes I wonder whether we should have that influence, but it's a real problem. It's partly because America is not there, and so we're sort of next in line. It's partly the history. I'm afraid it's partly that the regime is looking for external adversaries in the classic way, and it's pretty worrying that very clear expression of popular view is being crushed. And some of our staff have got mixed up in it. We really don't believe anybody was doing anything inappropriate or illegal, but we still have one member of staff in jail facing charges. We have others who have been intimidated and frightened so that they're staying at home and don't dare come to work. We've had staff expelled. I mean, there seems to be an effort to prevent us working effectively in Iran. And this is very frustrating, given that we have been trying to build a more modern relationship with Iran. What can we do? Well, I mean, if I knew the answer to that, I think I would be doing it. We've got to go on explaining that we are not in favour of any one or other candidate in the Iranian elections. We're in favour of a fair system, reflecting that pent-up feeling you got very clearly in the demonstrations of a lot of people wanting to have their say. That's where we want to be. One of the most successful bits of policy in recent years on Iran, I think, has been BBC Farsi TV, which is bringing an objectivity into Iran which the regime doesn't like at all. Just to switch briefly to EU enlargement, we've had a British policy which goes back many, many years now of being basically in favour of seeing enlargement of the European Union. We believe that the enlargement to Eastern Europe has been one of the great success stories of the Union, actually, the stabilization of Eastern Europe. And we would like to see that same stabilization rolled out to Turkey and to the Balkans to pretty much complete sort of the European space. What I think will happen is that we will complete enlargement with Croatia. I suspect that Iceland, who are now suddenly interested in joining following the crisis, will find a fairly easy passage into the Union, and everybody else will find it extremely difficult. And we're going to face a long, hard slog, frankly, to keep the aspiration of Turkish membership of the Union alive. I think we've got to go on keeping the aspiration alive, but it's not going to happen in the next decade, probably, I would guess. So it's a long-term policy. And maybe I can turn to Minouche for the last word on defence and the Strategic Defence Review.
I think I can probably confidently say that both our departments plan to be very closely engaged. I certainly know at DFID we've already assigned one of our directors to be very closely involved in that, and I'm sure the FCO will do the same. I think in terms of what we'd like to see come out of it, I think in some ways clearly there is an issue of resources and setting priorities and setting expenditure priorities that are consistent with the new challenges that we face in today's world. And I think that's clearly the central issue around the Defence Review. Do you want to say anything on that?
I agree. I mean, I think it's very sensible to start the planning for a Defence Review now. I think it also makes sense actually to complete it in the next Parliament, as the statement carefully said, when there'll be a new government and a new mandate. But the issues are urgent, and I think it's vital that we should be part of helping to describe the sort of foreign policy strategic picture that Defence Forces will be working in, and that DFID, bringing the development and security part into focus, should be very much involved as well. It's going to be quite a big piece of work, but it's good to start it early, I would say. I think I'm getting a signal. Should we? Yeah. Time for 5 more minutes if people have got that. Have we overlooked anybody who had a question before we wrap it up? Lady in the middle. Anybody else? Should we give you the last question? No? Gentleman over there. 2 last questions. Any raise on 2 last questions? Okay, let's make it 2 last questions and then we'll let people go.
Question for Minouche. Given DFID's overarching objective, as far as I understand it, is to reduce poverty, what do you think DFID's role is in terms of proactively contributing to the counter-terrorism agenda? And do you see any risk in associating DFID's work with counter-terrorism?
Okay. And the last question.
If you had one word to describe the United Kingdom, or perhaps 2 words, what would they be?
That's a good question. Okay.
You go.
I'll do counter-terrorism first. I mean, I think it's very important that that the purpose of our aid remains first and foremost poverty reduction. I think it's also important to say that there is absolutely no evidence that poverty causes terrorism. Actually, if you look at the backgrounds of most terrorists, they don't tend to be very poor, actually. They tend to come from a disgruntled sort of middle-class background, and there are issues about frustrated ambitions and aspirations, and it's not about poverty. Having said that, poverty creates fertile ground for terrorists to operate. So terrorists don't tend to be poor, but they can exploit poverty as a way to gain political support. And the work that we do in fighting poverty has the benefit of reducing that potential support. I don't think it's particularly effective or right that we focus our aid efforts on counterterrorism, but I think there are external benefits or additional benefits that come from fighting poverty that have benefits for the counterterrorism objectives. I think there's another dimension which maybe partly links to the second question, which is so much of the terrorist rhetoric is about how people see countries and what they associate with them. And the point that Peter made on Iran and the sort of issues about history and international reputation. And I think the work that we do on international development, it's not widely known except for in my kind of techie development circles, but I think we should all be proud of the fact that actually the UK is the best in the world at this. And it's not just me saying that. It's the OECD Development Assistance Committee, it's the Center for Global Development in the US, which ranks countries in terms of their performance on international development. It's the ONE organization, which is the Bono-Geldof organization, which has just ranked the G8 countries on their performance on international development, where the UK comes out tops both on quantity of aid and quality of aid. I could keep going. It's Bill Easterly, who's the biggest aid skeptic in the world, who ranked 48 development agencies in the world and ranked DFID as the best bilateral agency in the world. So we are really good at this. And my dream would be that in the future, when people think UK, they think, actually, that's a country that cares about poor people in the world and wants to make the world a better place for everybody. And to think of, so I would like people to say, UK, the best country in the world on development. That's my fantasy. I'm not sure we're there yet, but that's my fantasy.
It's very good, but it's too many words.
We should go back to Yeltsin's.
Yeah, that's
good.
Right. My one word is connected, actually, because it's amazing how Britain is in every single network going, more than any other country, actually. Not just the UN, not just the EU, not just NATO, but the Commonwealth. It's in our title, actually, as a department, and it's a fantastic network. And there's no other country that has its foot in as many networks as we do. So whatever happens, I think Britain is going to go on playing this role of brokering, of facilitating, of networking, and that's a distinctive national characteristic, which is in a way a plea for having internationally facing government departments as well. Okay, we've detained you from the rest of Civil Service Live. Thank you very much indeed for seeing it through with us. Thanks a lot.